It felt like yesterday when I met Robert. It was at a charity event in the town hall. The place was buzzing with people, all dressed up, looking their best. I was there because I felt like I needed to be part of the community after moving to the town only a few months ago. Robert was there representing his family's business. "Hi, I'm Robert," he introduced himself, extending his hand. His blue eyes looked genuine and friendly. "Hi, Robert, I'm Clara," I replied, shaking his hand. We chatted about everything under the sun, from our childhood memories to our favorite movies. I found out that he had grown up in this town and had a family business here. I told him about my parents and how I lost them when I was just a kid. He listened intently, and I could feel he genuinely cared. "I'm so sorry about your parents," he said sincerely. "It must have been tough growing up without them." "It was," I admitted, "but their love always remained with me. Plus, I inherited a good amount from my father. It helps me remember them." As the night progressed, we found ourselves more and more engrossed in our conversation, completely oblivious to the hustle and bustle around us. Before we knew it, the event was wrapping up. "Would you like to grab a coffee sometime?" Robert asked, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "I'd love to," I replied, smiling. Our coffee dates turned into dinner dates, and before we knew it, we were planning our wedding. It all happened so fast. I was 27, with an inheritance from my parents and a heart full of hope. Robert was everything I had ever wanted, or so I thought. After the wedding, I was introduced to his family. His dad, Mr. Lawson, was a gentle and warm man. The first time we met, he gave me a big hug and said, "Welcome to the family, dear. I hope you find all the happiness you deserve." Mrs. Lawson, on the other hand, was a stark contrast. She looked me up and down, her eyes cold and calculating. "I hope you know what you're getting into, marrying into our family," she said with a thinly veiled warning. Robert jumped in, trying to ease the tension. "Mom, be nice. Clara is my wife now, and I expect everyone to treat her with respect." In those early days, I tried to focus on the positive. I was in love, and I was hopeful that things would get better with time. Little did I know the roller coaster of events that awaited me in the next few chapters of my life. Several months into our marriage, things seemed to be going well. Robert and I had settled into a rhythm. We would often take evening walks, discussing our plans for the future. Our home was a cozy space that we both loved. One morning, I woke up feeling a little off. I was nauseous and had a strange feeling in my stomach. A few days later, the realization hit me. Could I be pregnant? I quickly bought a pregnancy test, and to my shock, it came out positive. I was flooded with a mix of emotions. While I was excited about the possibility of becoming a mother, I was also nervous about how Robert would react, especially considering his mom's clear disdain for me. That evening, after dinner, I decided to share the news. "Robert," I began, taking a deep breath, "I have something to tell you. I'm pregnant." He looked at me, and for a moment, his face was unreadable. Then, to my surprise and hurt, he said, "Is it even mine?" I was taken aback. "What? Of course it is. How can you even ask that?" He looked away, avoiding my gaze. "It's just... I don't know, Clara. Everything happened so fast. Our marriage and now this. I need some time to think." I tried to hold back my tears, feeling a mixture of anger and hurt. "Robert, I never expected this from you. This child is ours, and I hoped you'd be happy." He didn't reply. Instead, he left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The next few weeks were tough. My pregnancy symptoms started to kick in, and Robert's cold behavior didn't help. I found solace in the fact that this child was a symbol of our love, even if Robert didn't see it that way. One day, Mrs. Lawson came over unannounced. "I heard the news," she said without preamble. "Is it even true?" "Yes, it's true," I replied, trying to maintain my composure. She smirked. You think having this child will solidify your place in this family? You're wrong. I felt a surge of anger. This is my family too now, and this child will be a part of it whether you like it or not. She scoffed. We'll see about that. And with that, she left. The next few months were a blur. I tried to focus on my health and the baby, but the constant tension at home and Robert's doubt wore me down. My only comfort was the small kicks and movements I felt inside me, reminding me that there was a life growing within, waiting to meet the world. But little did I know that the challenges ahead were far greater than what I had already faced. As my pregnancy progressed, it became harder to manage everything on my own. I was constantly nauseous, and even the simplest chores seemed daunting. Robert was indifferent, often coming home late, leaving me to fend for myself. That's when he made the proposal I'd come to regret. Clara, he began one evening, I've been thinking. Since you're finding it hard to manage things here, and my parents' house is much bigger with help available, maybe we should move there for a while, until the baby arrives. I was hesitant. Mrs. Lawson's attitude towards me was clear, but at the same time, I felt weak and overwhelmed. I don't know, Robert. Your mom hasn't exactly been welcoming. He looked at me, trying to reassure. It's a big house, Clara. We won't even cross paths much, and Dad will be there. You know he likes you. In my vulnerable state, I agreed, thinking it might be for the best. Moving into the Lawsons' residence was an eye-opener. It was a grand house, reflecting the years of prosperity the family enjoyed, but with its grandeur came coldness. The vast hallways echoed with silence, the huge rooms felt devoid of warmth. The only solace came from Mr. Lawson. Welcome, Clara, he said with a kind smile, giving me a comforting pat on the back. Don't worry about anything here. Consider this place your home. But the peace was short-lived. Mrs. Lawson's digs and snide remarks were a daily ordeal. She would comment on everything, from the food I ate to the clothes I wore. One day, when I was in the kitchen trying to make myself a sandwich, she walked in, her eyes scanning me up and down. You sure you should be eating that? She commented, looking at the sandwich. I took a deep breath. I think I know what's best for me and my baby. She smirked. Well, if it is even your baby. I felt my anger rise but held it in check. It's Robert's baby, and I wish you'd stop implying otherwise. She just laughed, a cold sound that echoed in the large kitchen. Time will tell, dear. Time will tell. Days turned into weeks. Each day was harder than the last. The house felt like a prison. Robert was always out, and when he was home, he was distant. The baby inside me was my only comfort, reminding me that there was a reason for enduring all this. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room trying to read, Robert stormed in, a frown on his face. Clara, I heard you've been talking back to my mom. I looked up, surprised. She has been nothing but rude to me, Robert. What do you expect? He shook his head. This is her house. You need to respect that. I felt tears forming. I thought it was our house too, but every day it feels like I'm walking on eggshells. He didn't say anything, just turned and left the room. I sat there, feeling more alone than ever. As the days passed, the cold shadows of the house seemed to close in on me. But I held on, hoping for better days, not realizing that the worst was yet to come. Fall had settled in, and the leaves outside had started their gradual transformation to a vibrant mix of red and gold. The wind carried with it a sharp chill, heralding the coming winter. But inside the house, the atmosphere was even colder. One evening, after a particularly tiring day, the baby wouldn't stop crying. He was restless, and I tried every trick in the book to calm him down. Mrs. Lawson, evidently irritated by the cries, barged into the room. Why can't you keep that child quiet? It's unbearable. Holding my crying son, I replied tiredly, "He's just a baby, Mrs. Lawson. They cry sometimes." She scoffed. "Well, maybe if you were a better mother." "Enough of this," I retorted, fed up. "I'm trying my best here. I don't need your constant criticisms." Her face went scarlet with anger. "You have some nerve talking back to me in my own house." The commotion drew Robert in. "What's going on?" "Your wife seems to think she can disrespect me under my own roof," Mrs. Lawson spat. Robert glanced at me, annoyance evident in his eyes. "Clara, just take the baby to our room." Standing my ground, I replied, "Robert, this is our home too. I won't be bullied into hiding." He took a deep breath, his patience clearly running thin. "Clara, just do as I say." When I didn't move, Mrs. Lawson sneered, "If you can't follow the rules, maybe you should leave." Robert, to my shock, nodded in agreement. "Maybe you should." Stunned, I replied, "You can't be serious." His face hardening, Robert stepped forward. "If you won't go to our room, then maybe you should leave the house." "You're throwing me out?" I asked, voice shaky with disbelief. Robert didn't answer. Instead, he moved closer, took hold of my arm, and began pulling me towards the door. I tried to resist, but he was too strong. Holding our crying baby close, I was dragged out of the house. The door slammed behind me, leaving me and my child in the biting cold of the fall evening. Tears streamed down my face, not just from the cold wind, but from the sharp sting of betrayal. My own husband, the man I loved, had just thrown me out of our home. The magnitude of what had just happened weighed heavily on my shoulders as I walked away, holding my child close, trying to shield him from the cold wind. The weight of the night's events pressed heavily on my chest, making each step seem like a monumental effort. My son, sensing my distress, had stopped crying but was whimpering softly. I was at a loss as to where to go. It felt like the world had turned its back on me. Then, a thought struck me. Rachel, my oldest friend, someone who had stood by me during the happiest and saddest times of my life. We'd lost touch recently, primarily because of the tension in my home, but I was sure she'd help. She lived nearby, just a few blocks away. I headed towards her apartment, praying she was home. As I approached the familiar building, memories of our times together flooded my mind. Our college days, the late-night chats, and the countless cups of coffee we'd shared. I reached her door and knocked hesitantly. After what felt like an eternity, the door swung open, revealing a surprised Rachel. "Clara? My God, what happened to you? Why are you here in the middle of the night with the baby?" Choking back tears, I managed, "Rachel, I didn't know where else to go." She immediately pulled me into a tight embrace, murmuring words of comfort. "Come in, come in." Once inside, sitting on her warm couch with a hot cup of tea in hand, I recounted everything. From the tensions with Robert and his mother to the ultimate betrayal that left me on the streets. Rachel listened patiently, her face a mixture of anger and concern. I knew that Robert was changing, but this is unthinkable. I nodded, tears streaming down. He chose them over us, Rach, his own son. Rachel shook her head in disbelief. "I can't believe Mrs. Lawson would do something like this, but we'll figure something out, okay?" "I just don't get it. Why the sudden animosity? Why the doubt over our son?" Rachel sighed. "People change, Clara. Sometimes not for the better. But you've got your son and friends who care about you. We'll get through this together." Feeling a little calmer, I asked, "What do I do now, Rach?" She thought for a moment. "First, let's get you both settled for the night. Tomorrow, we'll think of the next steps. Maybe talk to a lawyer?" Nodding, I replied, "I never thought I'd need one against my own husband." Rachel gave a sad smile. "Life throws curveballs, Clara. But remember, you're strong, and you're not alone." Feeling a weight lift off my shoulders, I hugged Rachel tight. "Thank you." The night was spent in Rachel's guest room. Though I barely got a wink of sleep, having her by my side made me feel a bit safer, a little less lost. The road ahead was uncertain, but with friends like Rachel, I knew I could face whatever lay in store. The morning after the eviction felt surreal. Waking up in Rachel's apartment, the events of the previous night played back in my mind, and a sinking feeling settled in my chest. After a silent breakfast, Rachel, with her unwavering determination, declared, "We're going to get answers today." "You mean about Robert's sudden change and Mrs. Lawson's animosity?" I asked. "Exactly," Rachel responded, pulling out her phone. "I have a contact, Paul, a private investigator. He's helped some friends in the past. Maybe he can help us understand what's really going on." With that, Rachel dialed a number. "Paul? Hey, it's Rachel. I've got a situation here. Yes, I'll text you the details." Turning to me, she added, "He's good, Clara. We'll know what's happening soon." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Paul discreetly began his investigation, tailing Robert and Mrs. Lawson. Each evening, he'd provide Rachel and me with updates. It wasn't long before Paul unearthed shocking revelations. "I've been following Robert, and it appears he's seeing someone else," he said one evening, handing over a few photographs. My heart sank as I looked at the pictures of Robert and an unfamiliar woman, laughing, dining, and even shopping together. Rachel, anger evident in her voice, asked, "Do you have any idea who she is?" Paul nodded. "Her name's Angela, works in a law firm downtown, but that's not all. I've got audio recordings of Mrs. Lawson that you might find interesting." He played back a conversation where Mrs. Lawson discussed her elaborate plan to have me thrown out so that Robert could gain access to my inheritance. Her voice, dripping with greed, sent chills down my spine. "Once Clara's out of the picture, Robert can divorce her. With a good lawyer, he can claim a good portion of her inheritance for emotional distress or some such nonsense. Angela's firm will handle it. Our boy deserves that money more than she does." I sat in stunned silence. It all made a cruel kind of sense now. Robert's doubts about our son's paternity, the constant harassment, it was all part of a twisted scheme. Rachel, seething with anger, declared, "We're taking this to the police, and you're getting a lawyer, Clara. We'll fight them." Paul nodded. "I've got more recordings and photos. It's concrete evidence." While the truth was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing it gave me a renewed sense of purpose. No longer would I be the victim. With evidence in hand and Rachel by my side, I was ready to confront Robert and Mrs. Lawson and reclaim not just my inheritance, but my dignity and peace of mind. The chapter of betrayal in my life was about to be closed, and I was determined to ensure justice was served. With the evidence in hand and my resolve firm, it was time to confront my soon-to-be ex-husband and his conniving mother. I decided to go to their house, the house I once called home. Rachel insisted on accompanying me, a pillar of strength and support. As we approached the house, my heart raced, but not from fear. It was anger, determination, and the desire to close this traumatic chapter in my life. We rang the doorbell, and Mrs. Lawson answered, feigning surprise. "Clara, what brings you here?" Without mincing words, I replied, "You know why I'm here." Robert appeared from the living room, looking rather uneasy. "Clara," he began, but I cut him off. "No, Robert, it's my turn to talk. We know everything." I held up the photos and the transcripts of the recordings. Mrs. Lawson's face turned pale while Robert looked like he'd been caught red-handed. "How did you—" "Doesn't matter how," Rachel interrupted. "What matters is that you both have been exposed." I took a deep breath, finding my voice. "You thought you could play with my life? You thought you could get rid of me and take everything I've inherited from my parents?" Robert tried to speak. "Clara, No," I shot back. "I gave you everything. My love, my trust, and all you gave back were lies and betrayal. Your affair with Angela, your scheming with your mother to get your hands on my inheritance, you won't get a single cent." Mrs. Lawson, always the instigator, tried to salvage the situation. "Clara, dear, let's discuss this calmly. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding." I scoffed. "Misunderstanding. I've heard your conversations. You orchestrated this entire sham, making Robert doubt our child and pushing me out. And for what? Money? How low can you stoop?" Rachel stepped forward. "We've already spoken to the police, Mrs. Lawson, and Clara has a lawyer. You won't escape this." As we walked away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Confronting them had been cathartic. While the journey ahead would be long and challenging, I was ready to rebuild my life, free from the shackles of deceit and betrayal. The courtroom was filled with tense energy, a battleground of truth against deceit, the place where my long-awaited vindication would finally occur. My attorney presented our first piece of evidence, the results of the paternity test that unequivocally proved Robert was indeed the father of my child. The judge reviewed it, casting a stern look at Robert. "Do you have anything to say?" Robert looked down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "No, Your Honor." Next, we presented the DNA results that would shatter the very foundation of the Lawson family. "Your Honor," my attorney began, "these results indicate that Mr. Robert Lawson is not biologically related to Mr. Richard Lawson." The courtroom went silent. All eyes turned to Mrs. Lawson, her usual confident demeanor replaced with a deer-in-headlights expression. Richard, who had been sitting with a stoic face, looked at his wife with disbelief. You lied to me all these years?" Richard's voice wavered. Mrs. Lawson, trying to regain some semblance of control, stammered, "Richard, it's not what it looks like." But the evidence was irrefutable. The judge continued with the proceedings, his voice firm. Given all the evidence presented, the court rules in favor of Mrs. Clara. Robert Lawson will receive no part of her inheritance. He is also mandated to pay alimony for their child. Furthermore, considering the emotional trauma inflicted upon Mrs. Clara, the court also mandates Robert to pay damages. Mrs. Lawson, once the formidable matriarch, now looked small and defeated. But the courtroom had one more revelation that would strip her of her last vestiges of power. Richard stood up, facing his soon-to-be ex-wife. "I've filed for divorce, and I've already begun the proceedings to claim our house. You won't see a single penny from our joint assets." She was speechless, her empire and decades of manipulation crumbling around her. Walking out of the courtroom, the sunlight seemed brighter, the world fuller. Rachel hugged me tightly. "You did it, Clara. Justice is served." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. It's over. Finally. And as I moved forward, with my son in my arms, I knew I was walking towards a better, brighter future.